Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us across the country. We are right on the hour, so we will get started. Um, Welcome to the March webinar hosted by the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. This month's session is the Bridge In, Creating Seamless Pathways from Street to Shelter. My name is Grant Martin. Happy to be kind of your host MC today. Um, Today's session is being recorded, just as a heads up. And I would say if you're comfortable doing so, please feel free to say hello in the chat, and maybe share where you're joining us from today. That'd be lovely to see. Who do we have in the room with us? So I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get started. And Kevin, thumbs up, full screen on your end? Okay, great. So as I mentioned, this is the March webinar session with CSTN, the Bridge In. If you recall, we had originally planned for this session to take place in August of last year, and unfortunately, we had to cancel. So this is the rescheduled session. So I appreciate your patience, and I'm glad that we're able to circle back to this topic. Before we jump into the webinar, I want to acknowledge that me personally, I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Lenape, and the neutral Attawandaron peoples. I honor and respect the history, languages, and culture of the diverse Indigenous people who call this territory home, and I'm very grateful every day to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land. But I also want to recognize that CSTN is a national network. So from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. And I try to subscribe to land acknowledgements by personally stating what I can do as a treaty person. And I encourage others to seek learning and discourse about Indigenous communities. So those who learn, please share, and please ensure we are sharing truth. A few housekeeping items that I want to review. I believe that your computers are muted. That just helps because we are a larger group to keep down any background noise and things like that to not distract anybody. Attendees can ask questions at any time during the webinar. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can enter in your questions, and we'll make sure that we have time to review them during the Q&A portion at the last 30 minutes of the session. Please don't put your questions in the chat box. Please direct them to the Q&A, and the reason for that is that it's just easier to monitor the questions in that Q&A box. Today's webinar is being recorded, and so that will be circulated to everyone that registered for the session. Typically within a week or so after the session, I send something out. But if you're unable to attend, also, the recording will be archived on the website at transformshelter.ca. Our time together today is 90 minutes, no more, with the first 16 minutes with presentation and the final 30 for the Q&A, as I previously mentioned. So for those of you who may be newer to CSTN, we are a growing network of shelter leaders and organizations across the country who share a mission that is really a simple one, but I believe very powerful. So we aim to connect and support shelters that are committed to becoming housing focused and to being engines for ending homelessness in their communities. And we're really trying to build a national movement that helps shelters do this work more intentionally through things like webinars, peer connections, and shared advocacy. And at its heart, really, CSTN is about equipping shelters to help people move forward faster with dignity and into housing at the center of everything we do. So how does CSTN actually support shelters doing this work? First, through things like what we're doing today, through webinars and learning sessions, many led by shelter operators who are already on this journey of being housing focused. Second, we offer a self-assessment tool that's hosted on the website that was developed by OrgCode that really helps you see where your organization is at in becoming housing focused and identify any areas of potential growth for greater alignment. And the other way is through sharing of tools and opportunities to learn from each other. So, for instance, there's lots of really great people doing really great work and developing really cool stuff across the country. And so, through their generosity, are able to share things that they've developed that can be hosted on the website that you can go and check out, learn from, adopt, or make adaptations to, so that when you're kind of doing this change work within your organization and trying to develop new processes or resources, don't feel like you have to create everything from scratch, that you can learn from others and always reach out to CSTN if you're looking to build a connection with someone who's done some of this work before. We're happy to kind of broker those relationships. And you'll see also on the screen, there's a QR code. You can feel free to pull out your camera on your phone and scan that, and it will link you to a registration form that takes like honestly 30 seconds to fill out to become a member. Membership is completely free, and we invite everyone here to be a part of this growing community. You get to decide how active you are in that membership. It can be through things like just receiving updates from the network about upcoming activities, but you could also decide to be more involved by doing things like what we've seen from other members of helping lead webinar sessions or host different events and being a part of that, or sharing some of your own resources and tools that can be hosted on the site. So this is the homepage for the website at transformshelter.ca. You'll see at the top of the screen there, there's a couple tabs. One is I want to point you in the direction of the webinars that you can click on that, and it will have all of our previously hosted sessions there to be able to watch those recordings at your own time and leisure. And then the other is the tab around the resources that I mentioned that can include everything around like processes and forums and things like that related to various topics like diversion or how to accommodate pets or you name it, it's up there. And if it's not in there, what you're looking for, you can reach out to the network and see if we have anything. So I briefly want to walk through our agenda for today. We've gone through the housekeeping items. The main presentation today is titled The Bridge In, Creating Seamless Pathways from Street to Shelter. This month's topic recognizes that on any given day, in any given community in Canada, there are people who are residing outdoors and not accessing shelter. And so for many of them, the journey from the street into shelter is anything but simple. So things like trust, accessibility, communication breakdowns, and systemic barriers can make that first step feel out of reach. And this webinar really explores how outreach and shelter teams can work more collaboratively to create seamless person-centered pathways into shelter services and ultimately back into permanent housing. But I also do want to give a little bit of a note there as to say, we know that people don't have to necessarily go through shelter to be rehoused. People can be rehoused directly from their unsheltered situations. So we're hoping that through the practical strategies and reflection on some practices, participants joining us today will learn how to strengthen relationships across teams, reduce gaps in care, and build approaches rooted in dignity, consistency, and housing-focused support. So to lead us through this session, we're very pleased to have John DeCarmine, Principal Consultant with OrgCode Consulting, joining us today as our presenter. John brings with him extensive experience working in the sector, which I will share with you very soon. But following the presentation, we'll move into a Q&A session, and joining John for that discussion will be Kevin Webb. He is the Director of Emergency Shelter and Housing at the Calgary Drop-In Center, and he'll facilitate the questions from the audience. And then finally, we'll wrap up the session with a few closing remarks before we conclude, and we're really glad that you could join us today, and we're looking forward to some great discussion before we wrap up. So let me welcome and introduce our guest speaker, John DeCarmine. As I mentioned, he is the principal consultant from OrgCode Consulting and quite possibly the most optimistic nihilist you'll ever meet. He has spent years, decades in the trenches as a leader, shelter worker, outreach worker, case manager, COC lead, and service user. He is a recovering CEO, a recovering anarchist, recovering addict, aging punk, board game, and other forms of strategy nerd. He's a mountain man stuck in the flatlands of Florida. He's a dad, husband, and or friend to some of the most amazing humans you could ever hope to meet. He is consistently grateful for the opportunity to serve others and make programs work as well as they possibly can, and then some. He is an evangelist for the idea that everyone deserves a safe place to call home and is keenly aware that the idea of human beings sleeping on our streets is not normal, but rather unacceptable indication of policy failures and broken systems. So, with that, a big welcome to you, John. We appreciate you being here and are excited to hear what you have to share with us today. And so, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll pass things over to you. So, welcome, John.
Hey, thank you so much, Grant. Give me 1 second to get my own shared screen up. All right, and we are good to go. So, yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're coming from. Thank you for that introduction of reading my bio in full. It is always a wonderful and awkward experience. Yeah, so today we are going to talk about what we can do to help bring people in and try to create seamless pathways, which sounds sometimes like a buzzword, but really is about making sure that things are as consistent and as transparent as possible, understanding that most of the folks who we have the honor of working with out on the street are very often those folks who have the least trust in the shelter system and the least trust in maybe other kinds of programs or connections or referrals that we might be hoping to use to leverage to get them into housing quickly. So we'll hop into that in just a second. Let me first share, if you are not familiar with OrgCode, we've been around for about 3 decades. And under the leadership of Ian DeYoung since 2009, we primarily focus on systems transformations around the US and Canada and Australia. We work with the Canadian Alliance, the US National Alliance, and other national organizations, including CSTN, to establish policy, deliver trainings, and to basically make sure that people get the level of service that they deserve when they initially encounter our programs. I have been, as Grant said, involved in homeless services for about 30 years, starting with Food Not Bombs way back before the turn of the century. Had about a decade of frontline experience and about 16 years or so in leadership positions as a COC lead, executive officer or executive director, CEO, et cetera, but always wanted to stick around with the time I had spent in outreach. It was always the favorite part of the work that I had done, and always my what felt like the most genuine and exciting part. And then finally had the opportunity to run both a shelter and an outreach program at the same time, where because we were under the same banner, which is not always the situation we get into, we had a lot of really great opportunities to figure out how we could tighten up the communication, how we could tighten up the just the knowledge of what kind of work we were doing with somebody, and how to make sure that handing somebody from one program to another, sometimes multiple times, was never an opportunity for us to lose the momentum that we had to get people back into services. So today, I want to just talk briefly about that relationship between shelter and outreach, look at how we can coordinate our services more effectively, uh, look at just briefly how we can build trust and resolve some conflict, not just building trust between our programs and the people we serve, but sometimes building trust and resolving conflict between programs. There's a lot of opportunities for us to work together, but sometimes we've kind of positioned ourselves as two distinct, completely separate parts, almost two completely separate programs. And what we're going to come back to again and again today is that really outreach and shelter aren't separate programs that just occasionally intersect, but treating them as two functions of the same system. Because if we keep them as two distinct and separate things, then we're going to see housing placement stall, people start to fall through the cracks, and staff on both sides start to burn out trying to make up for maybe something that they see that it wasn't happening on the other side. But if we're operating together as an integrated team, we can get better outcomes and we can get better trust both between our services and the people that we have the honor to serve. So to start us off, let's just look briefly at some of the times that it makes sense for us to make sure we're coordinating, because in general, coordination should be the rule and not an exception, especially if somebody is engaging in both systems. So if an unsheltered person is considering shelter for the first time or the first time in a while, then it makes sense because outreach has had a relationship with that person and the shelter has the bed. And so there's benefits from learning from what outreach already knows, as well as leveraging that resource that the shelter has. If somebody's declined services in the shelter or they've disengaged, there's a lot of opportunities to connect outreach, particularly if they have an existing relationship from their time outside. If somebody is disappearing from shelter, if they're being marked as we don't know where they went, they disappeared, they went to a place not meant for human habitation, whatever that might look like, very often, if we're only working as a shelter, we're going to lose that person. And it may be days or weeks or months or years before we can actually reconnect with them. And so there are a lot of opportunities, even on the sort of drop off period when somebody is leaving shelter, where we can coordinate that outreach is there and ready to welcome them back into that program without having to lose any of the momentum. That's true again if somebody is cycling between the shelter and the streets. In many cases, outreach has done a lot of work to navigate barriers before somebody goes into the shelter. And just like we don't necessarily want to have somebody tell their whole story to us each and every time they show up in a new part of the program, we can really learn from a lot of what outreach has been able to do and figure out, or even look at the things that have been tried and haven't worked and not have to try those things again. And there's always opportunities. Sometimes a housing opportunity pops up and everybody has got to just sort of converge on this one goal and try to get one person moved into housing quickly. Or we need some kind of guarantee that a person who's been historically difficult to find sometimes. There are certainly some cases that I've seen where at minimum, if nothing else goes right, if we can count on a person being in a bed at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning when we have this phone call with somebody who's going to help us with a voucher or a connection to another resource, simply knowing that that person should be there at that time can help everything move forward more quickly. In terms of coordination, it also always makes sense to look at HIFIS data just to get a sense of who's receiving services where, because one of the things that can go wrong most commonly, it's not that somebody's only being served by one program, but it's when somebody's being served, they're touching multiple parts of the system. So maybe they are in and out of shelters and back and forth to the streets. Maybe they're using day services or getting meals or receiving mail someplace. But it's actually often the times when somebody is touching multiple services where it becomes easiest to lose track of what happens next because it's sort of easy to assume that somebody else might be taking the lead. So once we have a chance to look and see who's enrolled maybe in outreach, but not any other shelter or day service, or who's most commonly in shelter, but sometimes spends some time unsheltered, maybe that's due to length of stay requirements or to service restrictions. We want to have a sense of who's being served where, because if we get the coordination wrong, sometimes as outreach workers, we'll be re-engaging somebody who just left shelter without knowing why they left. Sometimes shelter staff can escalate a situation or maybe discharge somebody due to some issues around shelter expectations without having actually known the person's history or their triggers or what has worked with them before. Sometimes referrals are delayed because two teams aren't sharing information. And ultimately, any of those situations create an environment where a person who already has a high level of mistrust around working with the system is just going to feel like they're starting over again and again. And we're already doing so much work. It's kind of outrageous that we would be doubling the amount of work when there's so much other stuff to be done. So let's look at the relationship between shelter and outreach. And I want to start by asking this question. What does it cost us when we build trust by borrowing against the credibility of another part of our system? And I say this as a former outreach worker who found a lot of value engaging with people who did not find any kind of success working with local shelters. And it became really easy. It became sort of a shortcut to trust, if not at least familiarity, to be able to acknowledge, like, hey, we're different. You know, the shelter had a lot of expectations. There's lots of people there, and it gets loud and it gets crowded, and it feels like you have no privacy. But hey, out here, it's just us. And sometimes we've used the difference between shelters and outreach as a trust building opportunity that can actually do some, if we look at that long term, we're actually generating short-term trust at the cost of a long-term willingness for somebody to work with both of those systems. So sometimes it sounds like, hey, I know the shelters didn't work out so well for you in the past, but I promise you outreach is different. Or I get it, the shelter has a lot of rules and we're not like that. Or sometimes we can even throw shelter staff under the bus. Like those shelter staff just don't always get what it's like out here. And we as outreach do. And that's why we come to you. So we sometimes end up in situations where we're trying our best to connect with somebody, but we have to always leave that path open so that we're not doing harm to our ultimate ability to connect them to another service, particularly in this case, an emergency shelter. All unsheltered homelessness has a relationship with shelters. And that doesn't necessarily mean that shelter operators are doing a poor job. And I want to look at this briefly and then look at a brief sort of typology of how we can look at folks who are living unsheltered, just to kind of frame the rest of this conversation. But it can be that shelter was offered to somebody and the person said, no, I don't want shelter. Or they maybe have used the shelter and then decided that for whatever reason, they're not going back. It's a little bit different to be rejected by the shelter. There's certainly opportunities where, maybe a couple or a family wanted shelter, but were told they couldn't stay because they only served individuals, or maybe a specific rule wasn't followed, or they didn't fit whatever the program guidelines were. Or it could be that there was somebody else in the community who was determined to be more in need of shelter at that time. There can be issues with operating hours, particularly overnight shelters that aren't available during the daytime. Um, or depending on how we let people into the shelter, somebody might take their chances sleeping outside rather than having to line up each day without there being any kind of guarantee that they're going to get into the bed. When it comes to things like lack of space, this is generally when somebody was interested in shelter, but the shelter system itself didn't have the capacity to accommodate everybody who needed or sought those services. And in some places, this can be dozens of people. In other communities, this can be hundreds or thousands of people. Then we get to some of the stuff that really ties to the work that we're going to talk about today, because the reputation of the shelter is often something that will lead to somebody not even making an effort to access shelter. They've heard things about the shelter from other people, from maybe from other outreach staff, and they've just decided that they're not going. Even if the shelter might be safe, might have beds available, whatever that person has heard about the shelter is enough to keep them from thinking that it is a resource that might work for them. And then finally, we've got things like proximity to the shelter. If somebody lacks transportation or just simply the ability to get from point A to point B, there can be all the shelter space in the world available, but it's still ultimately inaccessible. So very often when we talk about unsheltered homelessness, too often we kind of lump everybody into this one big group of people. This idea that there's sheltered folks, that there's unsheltered folks. But if you look more closely at what unsheltered homelessness looks like, it typically breaks down into three primary groups. We've got, and these are the folks who we're going to encounter as outreach teams out on the street. There's folks who are new to homelessness and generally are doing everything they can to get out of homelessness as quickly as possible. And so here our work is more about just getting getting that information on resources available to them, making sure that we're tapping into their momentum to get out of homelessness quickly. So we're sharing information, we're making referrals, we're doing effective warm handoffs, which we'll talk about. And folks in this group tend to be more open to shelter if for no other reason than sort of the cultural thoughts on what's the solution to homelessness very often sounds like homeless shelters, even though we know that there are a lot of other ways that we can get people back into housing. With those folks, those can be as much as 50% of the population. Then we get into people who are kind of transitionally unsheltered and they're in and out. You may find them in a shelter one day, you may find them on the streets another day. Maybe they're in hospitals, maybe they're in and out of some kind of jail or other kind of like even if it's a crisis unit or a detox unit or something like that. But here, our work often ties more to making sure that whatever work has been done continues, that the information being shared is aware or is available to, and service providers are aware of important things they need to know about this person. And so Here, the work becomes more about maintaining a connection to the person and the services that they use. And then the entrenched folks, these are just like I said with newly homeless people. Folks who are relatively new to homelessness generally are doing everything in their power to get out of homelessness as quickly as possible. As we move toward folks who have been out on the streets for a longer period of time, generally that means they initially tried to do everything they could to get out of homelessness, and for some reason that did not work, whether it was interfacing with the providers or just not being able to get what they needed together to do it. Once people have tried extensively to get out of homelessness, they very quickly will shift into trying to do everything they can do to survive being homeless. And that is a different set of goals and a different set of needs than somebody may have on the earlier experience of homelessness. So folks who are entrenched in long-term homelessness tend to have had the most prior negative shelter experiences and general system experiences. Our coordination and our role here shifts more to helping people prepare for what the next service might be, being really clear and upfront and being consistent and advocating, sometimes advocating for the systems or the shelters we're trying to get them into, sometimes advocating for those people who may have had a negative experience before or may have been asked to leave before. And these folks are the ones who are the least likely to have any sort of trust in the system or the people working for it. And so we're going to talk largely today about folks who are in this transitional or this entrenched category so that we can make sure that we can provide the experience that people need to get them into shelter if that's something that would be beneficial to them or beneficial to our likelihood of getting them housed. So when we're talking about coordinating services, let's first look at what good service handoffs look like. Uh, we want to transfer all of the relevant knowledge about the person to support ongoing housing engagement. So this is everything from assessment scores to past experiences with other services that they've tried, looking at everything from income to their goals and their desires for what a housing placement that would work for them might look like. We want to clarify the roles and the responsibilities that we have going forward when we're sharing this information, and that includes helping people understand how they may interface with one program differently than outreach. Because one of the great things about outreach is we can be really, really flexible because we're not worried about navigating not only program expectations, but interpersonal conflict, for example. You know, that for the most part, people who struggle in shelters aren't at all bad people. They are for every part of it. They're not bad people, but there are sometimes struggles with living in a congregate way with 100 other people or even 20 other people who are all in crisis and who you didn't necessarily ask to be living next to. So being really transparent around what things are going to look like and what it means for this referral to be made. Very often we think about how we connect people with resources in terms of the resource being available or not available to them. And a good handoff, a warm handoff, really looks at the continuity of the relationship to the system as well. Whether that is me as an outreach worker or you as a shelter worker or anybody else in any role that they play, but helping that person navigate and the transition in a way that it doesn't just feel like they're being moved over, or sometimes it might feel like abandonment, but making sure that that all stays in place and that keeps that trust in place. We make sure that the person is aware of what's happening and they're consenting to this process. And we prepare both the person and the provider for what to expect. So sometimes that can be kind of like if you've ever worked in maybe supportive housing or case management, sometimes we've got to coach people for what it's going to feel like or look like to go talk to a landlord. Sometimes we have to help people understand what a case conferencing process is going to look like so there's no surprises when they get there. Other times, we might need to make shelter staff aware that, hey, this person should be able to do just fine in shelter, but it would be super helpful if you were aware of these two or three things that we have noticed in our opportunities to work with them. So, in every case, good service handoffs are about trying to keep that relationship intact as we move forward, even if it's not necessarily with us, but we don't want that person to feel abandoned or just kind of pushed into another program. So the kinds of coordination we might be looking like starts with, and this is kind of the gold standard, a warm handoff. The outreach worker might physically accompany the person into the shelter. They might stay present for the intake that they go through, and they're passing on the, hey, this person is going to be working with you now. This is how you can get in touch with them. This is how you can get in touch with me. And it really is very particularly helpful for folks who are coming in for the first time after a long time on the street, or for folks who have more complex needs. And it shows that we're still there to support somebody, whether or not we're the person who they're working with. For pre-entry coordination, it can be really valuable just so that outreach and shelter staff are talking and sharing relevant context. Shelter staff basically knows who's coming, why they're coming, and what will make the first night go well. Expectation management can be really valuable, again, both for the person coming into the services as well as the shelter. Sometimes we start to assume whether or not somebody is ready for shelter, whether they are interested in going to shelter, or whether they think that is what is best for them. And there's really nothing worse we could do than put all this effort into sending somebody to a shelter that they never wanted to go to in the first place. There are ways that's not going to be good for the person. It's not going to be good for the shelter. And there are ways that we can be really transparent and communicate about that, but letting people know what it's going to be like. Shared case documentation to make sure so that we actually have all the relevant information that's needed. And if that's not possible, at minimum, just sort of a one-page handoff summary that would replace the full information that somebody might see in HIFIS. Planning on doing joint case conferencing so that outreach and shelter staff are reviewing cases together. And sometimes we might just be coordinating around immediate crisis needs, whether that is a situation related to intimate partner violence, or somebody, if there's an encampment closure scheduled and somebody just needs a place to be for a couple days while they figure out what's next. But there are all kinds of different ways that we're going to end up finding a lot of value in having outreach and emergency shelter staff working in the same ways. So for those handoffs, we have to start with this understanding that however great an outreach program would be or might be, or a shelter program might be, there's still no single program is going to meet every single need for somebody. And if we can do referrals well, then we can make sure people are moving forward faster. So when we're doing this, we want to make sure that people become aware of who they'll be contacted by, what information we're sharing, why we're sharing that information, and really, again, just like with the relationship, trying to make sure that there's continuity, making sure it's not just feeling like an abrupt, fresh start. If we can do referrals well, then we build trust with people and we build confidence that they can still get help that they need, even if it's not with us. And if we do it right, then we can actually have some sense of if it actually worked, because the worst possible referrals we could do are the ones where we just tell somebody, yeah, call this place. This should work. Or, I heard that there's a bed available here, because sometimes we are afraid to say no, or afraid to tell people we don't have the answer, but making assumptions about what the right service might be without actually confirming that on our own can actually be really disrespectful. We sometimes struggle to know who the right service is or what the right support is, even knowing how the system works and knowing who's there, and maybe even having a car or a cell phone number of somebody there. And if we give somebody bad information, we're ultimately asking somebody to carry everything they own, navigating public transportation and taking hours and hours of their days just to get there and figure out that it wasn't actually what they thought it was going to be. So there's a lot of trust that comes from us making good and appropriate referrals. So if we do a warm handoff well, that means first, all consent is in place. So the handoff is going to be a step forward in the relationship, and they know where they're going. They know what we have shared with them. Ideally, we're able to personally introduce the participant. If not in person, well, we might even be able to do that by telephone. The information that is needed is shared directly. We can't just send somebody who is we acknowledge that they're in crisis. We acknowledge that they have complex health needs, but then we sometimes also ask them to remember to share this exact information in this particular way. It's always going to be better if we can share that information directly, ideally in writing through an email or something else. When somebody shows up, they should know exactly who they're going to meet and why. We'll talk about this in a minute, but so much of this actually ties to some of those core tenets of trauma-informed care. The idea that we build trust by being transparent with people, that we try to avoid surprises wherever possible by being consistent, by having staff all show up in the same way or responding to the same kind of issue in the same way each and every time. That also extends to just people being aware of where they're going and what they're being asked to do. The shelter should always be expecting the person with ideally somebody there designated to keep an eye out for them when they come in with you and to greet them warmly and welcome them in. And it's always tied to both teams understanding the shared goal of the transition, which is not just to get somebody in a shelter bed for the night, but to keep them moving forward in a way where they could actually be housed more quickly. If we do these warm handoffs well, again, we build trust, we build accountability, and we build momentum. And this is especially true for people who have not always had the best experience working with any part of our system. And it's really important because if we don't get this right, if we make a referral in the wrong way and the person suffers because we didn't do the work correctly. We lose contact with them. They get frustrated and are less willing to engage with the next person who comes by, or there can even be re-traumatization. So a good warm handoff at minimum involves walking or traveling with the person to the shelter in this case, calling ahead to explain those contexts and the goals before somebody arrives, staying at minimum for the first few minutes of the new intake, but trying to make sure that there's a smooth start. Probably doing a little bit of role playing beforehand about how that shelter intake process might go, which really calls on us to have some awareness or at least knowledge of what kinds of questions are going to be asked. And then making sure that we follow up the next day to see how things went on their first night. Again, maintaining that connection with people as we go. If we do this the wrong way, if we have a bad handoff, it looks a lot like this. Giving somebody a flyer and saying you can try to call them, sending someone across town without actually figuring out if they're open or taking new people on, referring somebody who doesn't meet eligibility requirements, again, referring somebody to shelter who doesn't want to be there. We don't necessarily need to take the first no that somebody shares with us as the absolute final answer. We can need to explore what it is that might make them resistant or reluctant to go to shelter. Maybe it's some reputational issues, maybe it is past experiences, but there's stuff that can be explored there. But at the end of the day, we don't want to just send somebody to shelter who doesn't want to be there and assume that we've made the connection that we need. Promising an experience that you know isn't realistic, telling them that everything will be fine once they get there, or even sort of the extreme cold referrals or of sending them to somebody that you've never had a relationship with and who isn't expecting them or not doing that follow-up. So for us to do this well, it starts with us really having to coordinate information. Um, we need to make sure that people are aware, particularly the receiving shelter staff, of what is the person's history. What is the context? How long have they spent on the street? Have they been to shelter before? What did that look like? Are there potential issues with shelter stays, whether those are tied to health problems or mental health problems or substance use or anything else? Real-time status beyond just a vulnerability assessment that somebody may have done months ago, but where are they at right now with health concerns, with their vulnerability, with their substance use, with their mental health, with the status of their documentation? What kinds of things have worked for them? People, especially outreach workers, are phenomenal at finding the cadence and the pace of conversation, but also of introducing new information that works well for people who are out on the street. So sharing some information around communication style, who they trust, who they don't trust, what hasn't worked due to from past services, institutional distrust, Any active goals? Again, we're treating this as a continuity. It's not just a fresh start when somebody comes in. So, do they already have housing goals? Do they already have preferences? What is it that we know that they want? And what kind of misgivings or concerns does somebody have around going into a shelter? What are the things that are most likely to lead them to throw their hands up in the air and say, I knew this was a bad idea. I'm already ready to get out of here. How can we anticipate some of those things that will make it just a little bit smoother for both shelter staff and the person coming in to get these services? Now, this is when we look at what good coordination looks like. This requires a lot more work than just faxing an intake form to the shelter or dropping somebody off at the door, or maybe even a shelter only calling outreach after a discharge is imminent if somebody has past experience with outreach. For us to get here, we've got to do a little bit of additional coordination. We always want to use a shared database with all the appropriate permissions and consents in place. We also have to start looking at the teams who are functioning to be tied more to who they're serving than the agency they're coming from. So we need to have outreach talking with shelter staff and at least shelter case managers that give some opportunities for things to look like a joint staffing meeting, or that opportunity to say, here's what they're working on, here's what the barriers are, here's what the next steps are. Having open channels of communication beyond just an email or case notes that can look like having each program manager texting the other one about questions that are popping up, having a phone call between two people so we can have an awareness of what's going on and what's moving forward and what's not. It can be really helpful when we move people in to have a specific person there who is ready to greet people, to be the point of contact. It's not just when you're there, if you have any problems, talk to staff. It might be, so for the first week while you're there, if anything pops up, talk to Kevin or talk to this person who is specifically aware of your situation, your case, and can provide you some information with an understanding of the fact that this might be a little bit challenging for you to come in. And then also, we might want to look at separate coordination meetings that are kind of like coordinated entry or coordinated access meetings, but bringing together shelter and outreach staff so that we can be looking at all of these things as they tie to somebody's position on the by name list. And if we can't see each other's information, if there's not shared access, at minimum, we at least want to put together something, some kind of one pager that looks like this. One, do we have the consent to share this information? Two, who are they? So, not just what is their name and their date of birth, but how long have they been out on the street? What has their past experience been? What other information is relevant? The biggest piece about this is, what should shelter staff know tonight? Considerations around health, substance use, known triggers, what has worked to engage people or to de-escalate people? What is the status of their housing engagement? Are they connected to coordinated access? Are they document ready? Are there pressing tasks? Is there a meeting with another system representative or a landlord or something in the next few days that they need some help on? And getting down to that question of who actually has the lead on working with this person. Even if outreach has been case managing them and doing some work to connect them to coordinated access over the years, does this mean that we are now handing that off to a shelter case manager? Or does it mean that the outreach specialist is going to maintain that connection with them? Either one can work just fine, but we have to have clarity around that so that it doesn't create some disadvantage for the person. Will there be ongoing outreach involvement? Will we stop by tomorrow? Will we be the ones who make the phone call for them on this other situation, or is that something we're handing off to shelter case management? And finally, particularly for people who might be reluctant to move into a shelter bed, what do they want the shelter staff to know about them? What can we, how can we, in our advocacy role, try our best to make sure that people at the shelter know everything that this person wants shared about them in a way that might make it more likely that they're going to have a really positive experience there? And there's a lot of different ways that we are mutually supportive systems. We have outreach who bring folks who are out on the street information on shelters. For somebody who's newly homeless, that might be the exact resource that they were looking for or trying to get more information on. Sometimes outreach shows up and they can advocate to shelter staff on behalf of people who they've already engaged. Sometimes that might be related to service restriction issues. Sometimes that might be tied to any kind of exits or program discharges that we're looking for a chance to get somebody back in. We can share real-time word on the street, both about the shelter, about what's going on with the drug supply. And we can help people explore their ambivalence around shelter when people are considering services. So they can do that with somebody they trust without having to first walk through the door. Outreach workers have to know a lot about shelters. They have to know the intake process, the physical environment. And I want to highlight the work that Kevin had done in moving folks from encampments into the smaller shelter at the DI that basically like even went so far as to share a video with people about here's what it looks like where we're asking you to come in so that people aren't actually coming into something that might be surprising. Outreach workers should know what a typical night involves. Are you going to be told to go to bed at a particular time? Are you going to be asked to wake up at a particular time? What time can you count on breakfast being available? And on the shelter side, shelters can support outreach in a lot of great ways too. Very often there is information sharing in place. Very often, uh, shelters have good information on who's there, who's leaving, who's thriving, what overnight staff are hearing, what documents somebody has stores. Uh, Shelters are also really good at providing things like storage and meals and mail services, which are very often one of those first ways that unsheltered people might dip their toe into considering whether they would come in. And it's based on how they're treated and what things feel like when they go there. Shelters can do some of that crisis response support, like we had talked about before. If somebody's in a situation where they cannot be near somebody else in a camp or there's something else going on. Uh, Outreach staff can use and sort of leverage shelter services by doing some inreach when there's day services and drop-in access if there's somebody who that they expect might be coming by. There's also a lot that can be done when shelters are seeing themselves as a part of the whole system, understanding that discharges from the shelter should involve a connection to outreach, particularly if we're afraid we're going to lose sight of somebody, particularly if we are not sure that we know how to get in touch with somebody. And shelters can support outreach by being flexible in a lot of challenging situations, understanding that the folks who are coming in for shelter, just like there's different typologies of unsheltered homelessness, there's different typologies of sheltered homelessness. And shelters have to be flexible to understand that not everybody coming in has the same complexity of needs or the same goals, or whether they're even looking at long-term goals versus immediate crisis needs in that moment. To close out, I want to look at just a couple things we can do to build trust and resolve conflict. First, with participants, we build trustworthiness through transparency and through consistency. We actually build trustworthiness in the same ways with our partners. So we always want to make sure people understand what is happening and when it's happening. Making sure, if we could remember nothing else, just making sure there's no surprises, making sure that they're greeted in the ways that we would hope they would be greeted when they get there, that the person who they're expecting to speak with is there as they've been promised. We have to make sure that we're not pushing people into a service they don't want. Sometimes our sense of urgency can take precedent over the actual real sense of urgency. And so if somebody's been out on the street for 5 or 6 years and they're still unsure if they want to go into shelter, we could probably spend an extra day or two that they'll survive out on the street while we explore that ambivalence and explore that uncertainty and get a sense of what their real concerns are. We want to avoid any kind of surprises around what the process might look like, around the barriers that might pop up, around what their next steps might be. We always want to make sure they know what information is being shared and why, and being really transparent about what we'll be doing from here in the future. Will we still be involved? For many people, if we're not careful, service handoffs can feel like abandonment, particularly if we don't do the additional work of having conversations with people and explaining how we'll still be involved, or at least letting them know if we're not able to be involved. With our partners, and this is something I've seen bringing people into shelter and receiving folks into shelter. Sometimes we think we're doing the person, we're advocating for the person if we kind of don't share everything about what's going on. We might not be quite as clear about just how complex somebody's issues are or what their needs are. So we want to make sure that shelters, for example, have a clear understanding of what's really going on with this person when we're working with partners, and outreach sees this probably more than anybody else, only work with verified information, or as I've heard Grant call it, like not working with only one source information, but trying to get information that is accurate around anything from issues with the program or a service restriction or an escalation or anything. We all know that we have to straddle trusting people and building trust with people, and also holding to some extent a healthy degree of skepticism about whether the story we hear on the street is the full story. And very often people are going to share information that they think makes it most likely they will get their needs met. It is a very natural thing, it is a very understandable thing, but making sure that we're not just taking at face value that something terrible happened at the shelter or something, didn't happen at the shelter that was supposed to happen. We have to follow up and be consistent with our program partners in the same way that we do anything else or anybody else. We have to address issues early, not after they've grown. If there is a staff member who is not engaging with people in the right way, or engaging with people in a way that leaves them feeling dignified and respected, but instead leaves them feeling talked down to or belittled, we've got to talk through that stuff early, not after it becomes such an issue that nobody would come into that shelter. Again, avoiding surprises. That can be anything around basic information sharing, but that can also tie to our program hours have changed. The time we serve meals has changed. People's access to storage has changed. Anything like that that's program specific that is ultimately needed to share accurate information with people on the street. And then one of the places we can lose trust very quickly is when we don't give credit where credit is due. Sometimes we end up in situations where, well, outreach may have worked with somebody for years, and then the last 20 days they're in the shelter, and then suddenly we see that the shelter is taking credit for housing them. That doesn't happen often, but when it does, it breaks trust. So we always want to make sure that we give credit where that credit is due. And when somebody moves into housing, we don't want to just take credit as the last program they were a part of. We want to name that collaborative work that has happened to system leaders, to funders, to people in the community, so that they're aware that this is a great example of the system working together. Let's look at just a couple quick things that we can do to align shelter and outreach. So, first, with outreach, we want to document to support the transition. Very often, we do case notes that document here's what service was provided, maybe here's why it was provided, but it's kind of this who, what, when, where, how, and why stuff that is effective and important for a case note. But we also need to be documenting so that people are aware of who's showing up and what they need to know and what they need to know to make that first night successful. We want to be really clear about confidentiality, what we're sharing and why with our program partners. We want to assess, but not assume that somebody is ready for shelter. Even if they told us they might be willing to try it, even if they told us they guess that might be something they would consider, we want to have really accurate, real time understanding of what their expectations are when they're coming into the shelter. And we have to manage some of those expectations. Um, when we are first sending somebody into shelter, or explaining to somebody that maybe being discharged from the shelter could lead to a relationship with outreach, we have to talk about what that means, because people probably have some understanding in their head of what they think that should look like. And if those expectations aren't met, we're then setting ourselves back in terms of actually keeping that connection and keeping that trust with them. And we want to do everything we can to preserve the relationship after somebody moves into shelter, even if that's just making sure we greet them by name the next time that we're there for an in-reach. um, event that we're going to do. On the shelter side, we want to make sure that we're treating intake as a continuity, as a continuation of services, not a fresh start, particularly if somebody is coming in from outreach. Here's what I think might be one of the biggest things that I have seen go wrong in this. Very often across the system, shelters, outreach staff, supportive housing, day services all claim to do things like being lower barrier, to be reducing harms. But they don't always implement those in the same way. And so if you've got an outreach team that has been entirely comfortable performing and conducting harm reduction, education, sharing strategies, and that includes being okay with the fact that you might see somebody visibly using drugs and they think they're going to a harm reducing shelter where there's also an expectation that you're not bringing substances onto the campus, you're going to lose that person's trust. It's not on them to understand the sort of nuance of what harm reduction looks like at shelter and what it looks like in outreach. It is on us to explain to them some of those key differences because otherwise it feels like a deception for somebody. Again, designating that staff contact for outreach coordination, managing those expectations, and staying ahead of potential exits, not just telling somebody that they've left when they are, gone for 24 hours, but letting people know that this might be happening. There's an upcoming discharge. Is there something that we can do to leverage your relationship with them to either maybe help them engage a little bit better with services or to minimize the impacts of the disruption of them being exited from the shelter? At the end of the day, the goal for both of our teams is the same. We're trying to move people into housing, and it can be really helpful if we can evaluate all of our operational decisions around that goal. Back to what I was just talking about. We have to make sure we're operationalizing things in the same way because unfortunately, we don't always mean the same thing when we say housing first or harm reduction or even trauma informed. So these have to be commitments operationally, and we have to be doing them in the same way. So again, if harm reduction looks different in the shelter than it does on the street, we have to sort that out before it becomes an issue for the person who we're working with. We have to cross train. Outreach workers should be aware of shelter hours and what the intake process looks like. Shelter staff or shelter case managers should be aware of what kinds of things outreach has done with the person or whether they can reasonably expect them to get somebody document ready. They should also be able to explain, well, if you are going out and you're going to stay on the street somewhere, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have access to an outreach worker at the same level that you might shelter staff because it's going to be much more rooted in when they're coming by. And then coming through to make sure that we're aligning the case planning and the case conferencing, even if somebody is touching multiple programs, or especially if somebody is touching multiple programs, making sure that we're not losing sight or thinking that one person has the lead on this when the other person is assuming that we have the lead. So, as some first steps that we can go through, one, we want to schedule some kind of standing weekly check-in at minimum between shelter case managers and outreach leads. Um, they have to meet regularly to review shared caseloads, even just that overlap, address any kind of issues, and make decisions. Because when we're in this point or at this point, some of the decisions that have to be made cross program boundaries. We have to have a regularly reviewed list of people who are touching both programs. We have to have some kind of one-page summary for those shelter referrals from outreach if we can't find it. And sometimes, depending on the system, even if we do have access to the shared database, still sometimes that one pager is a lot easier to look at and just scan quickly than to find a case note over here and a program exit date over there. We want to have norms for sharing information on program exits. So that might look like we're going to let you know 2 weeks before somebody is asked to leave, and then another week, and then we'll ask them where they're planning on going and share that information with you. But making sure that everybody can expect the same information on the same timeline. And then finally, at minimum, coming back to a quarterly review when we have identified who touches both of these programs, who's getting housed, who's not getting housed, and why, and using that as part of a continuous improvement process to make sure that we can not only improve the shelter program and the outreach program, but also the person's experience in touching both of those programs as they navigate trying to get off of the streets. And that is what I have for y'all. I know we have a Q&A part coming up, so I'll stop there and hand it back to Grant.
That's perfect. Thanks, John. And I just want to say, like, John, if I can give out awards, one that, I mean, besides the amazing content, is you are possibly the best presenter at finishing right on time. Like how you time your slides and your speaking notes or whatever, like you're a wizard at it. So great job. Um, so we are entering into the Q&A portion of today's session. So I can see that some questions have already started to trickle in a little bit in the Q&A and in the chat. So now's the time to add your questions in that Q&A box. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kevin to get us rolling.
Great. Thanks, everyone. John, thank you. Tons of incredible information. The 11 a.m. thing, I don't know how you do it. We're going to have to talk and get some lessons on that. Um, Grant, you usually have one or two notes that you want to jump in with questions. Is there anything that you want to do right away?
You know me too well, Kevin. So yeah, let's get Grant out of the way first. One is I just want to make a comment. Everything that you were sharing, John, strikes me as like this piece that I've been hearing more and more from people, which is like this piece around like clarity is kindness, right? So how are we being clear and providing clear and accurate information, clear and accurate around like how we connect people, what they can expect, all those things. So that really resonated with me and stood out. What I also appreciate too, from my own experience of being in different parts of the system, is that sometimes when we ask follow-up questions with people, either clients or the outreach worker or the shelter worker, trying to gather some background information, those questions I think can sometimes be met with defensiveness because I think that people often attribute questions with not trusting the system and using those questions to find reasons to screen them out of a service. And so we need to be really clear out the get-go is to say, um, these questions are to really kind of help us know and understand your situation better so that we can screen you in and match you to the right thing, not as a way to weaponize and screen you out. And I think that your content really kind of highlights that really, really well. Um, and so with those comments, I'm just going to pass it back over to Kevin. Thanks.
Okay. I have about 4,000 questions as well, but we're going to jump into some that are on the Q&A. The first one is from Peter, and it is, how do you help deeply psychotic homeless people who have been banned from shelters?
I couldn't tell if that was rhetorical or if you're asking me directly. I just want
I'm
to.
asking you directly.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So that is, of course, we'll start with one of the most challenging questions. Thank you for that, Peter. But um, it depends. There are sort of I want to distinguish between somebody who might be deeply psychotic in a way that is maybe communication is more challenging, but there are no health or safety risks to other people in the shelter. And sometimes deeply psychotic people, to use your terms, get banned from shelters not because they're unsafe or dangerous, but because people don't know how to work with them, or because being psychotic translates to an unwillingness to work with a particular case manager or anything else, or it is because people were just uncomfortable, not actually unsafe around that. So there's always some kind of like not trusting one source information. There's always some additional information to find. The other reality is that sometimes people are out of the scope of our programs. Most of our outreach teams do not have clinical psychotherapists who are on there. Sometimes we get street medicine connections. Sometimes we get connections to people who are equipped and skilled to deal with that. But the reality is, sometimes people are well beyond the scope of what can be addressed with kindness and respect and being trauma informed. And so, in those cases, sometimes it looks like we have to advocate more uh, aggressively, for lack of a better term, to connect people with services. Sometimes it is around building a relationship with them to be that one person who they do trust in the conversations that they're having, and to understand that there might be reasons for their lack of trust with other providers due to how they perceive the treatment that they received. So at the end of the day, there is no outreach team that would, I think about how I want to say this. It's it's rare that an outreach team could engage with somebody with very, very high psychosis and other sort of other similar or associated mental health issues without an appropriate housing placement at the end that would, you're not going to probably move that person into a one-bedroom apartment, have them sign a lease after they meet the landlord and call it done. We understand that, housing first is built on this idea that everyone is ready for housing now if that housing has the right supports for people to help them maintain that housing. And sometimes we're asked to do quite literally the impossible. Like we know what outreach is in terms of deep engagement with people who either can't or won't seek other services. And it doesn't mean we're not going to get a call from somebody in local government who's going to say, hey, listen, I know what you guys do, but there's this guy who's been standing on the corner for 3 days, and I need you to go talk to them, as if that person can just get moved into housing very quickly, too. So some of it is having some boundaries around what we can and cannot do and what we can and can't be reasonably expected to do. And I'm not saying that that means this person is unhousable at all. I'm saying the level of support that that person needs is they are housable, and there are other professional supports and often clinical supports that are going to be required to get somebody connected to the appropriate services that they actually need.
Thanks, John. And I can add to that just from a shelter perspective. John talked deeply about that, building that collaboration between shelters and outreach. And often in a shelter, there's so much things happening and everything going on. And if someone is asked to leave, we may not have all that information that goes along with it. So having that relationship with the outreach team to be able to come back to the shelter and say, hey, Joe is in this situation and is highly vulnerable because of that situation. I would hope that most lower barrier shelters are going to remove that barrier to get the person into where it's safer and more supportive for them. So, yeah. Moving on to another one. If someone's going to start an outreach program in a small shelter in a small city, what would your number one piece of advice be? Or what would you say is the most important thing to start up a successful outreach branch of a shelter or drop-in?
All right, I'm seeing a pattern here. You're asking me again, right?
These are all going to you.
Okay, great. So, the most important thing is to figure out what problem you're trying to solve. Just like anything else, you can ask 10 different people what the purpose of a shelter is, and you're going to get at least 5 different answers. You can ask 5 different people what the purpose of street outreach is, and you're going to get 5 different answers. And so some of it comes with understanding, what are you trying to do? Is your outreach team designed just to be in-feed into the shelter and find people who may not know that shelter services were available? Because that's one role. Is it going to be about engaging deliberately with people who have chosen not to come to shelter and providing the best of the services that your shelter offers to people, regardless of whether they do well living in congregate settings? Or sometimes we get outreach teams funded because the entire public goal of it is we're tired of seeing unsheltered people living on the street, so we think we need an outreach team with no real consideration that the ultimate success of the outreach team is tied to the capacity of the broader housing system that they are actually working in. And so it's really, and I'll throw my email into the chat just so if you want to have ask some follow-up questions, I'd be happy to talk through that with you and try to sort it out. But it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. What I would say in terms of general really important things are one, don't just think you're doing emergency shelter stuff outside of the building because that is you're engaging with people in a different way and you have different opportunities to engage with people. All of them come back to building trust. All of them come back to ensuring that people are aware of what's available and what it's going to look like and being transparent. And here's what our program does, and here's what our program doesn't do. But figuring out who you want to be serving so that it's not just, well, we do this set of services inside a building and this set of services outside a building. The second thing would be to get really well aware or trained up on the distinction between setting goals with people, which is something that is more likely to happen in a shelter, goals being sort of more long-term planning and understanding that if you are working with people who are outdoors, they are probably much closer to, if not completely enmeshed in survival mode. And that very often newer outreach teams make a really common mistake, and that is engaging with somebody, that person saying, I don't want what you're offering. And then we just chalk that up as this person doesn't want to be housed, and we move on and never work with them again. But understanding that very often to build trust with people who are living outdoors, you're really starting by meeting immediate needs. You're not talking about what they might want to do 2 years from now, because if you're in survival mode, 2 years from now doesn't exist. An hour from now exists, maybe tomorrow, but you can't even set an appointment with somebody for 2 weeks in the future and reliably think that that's going to be meaningful to them in 2 weeks if they're worried about the pressures of survival. So understanding some of those key differences between working with somebody in, well, I'll tie it real quick to the stages of change. We're probably familiar with people are pre-contemplative in the change process, or they're contemplating change, or they're taking action steps toward change. When you're working with somebody in shelter, you can more or less assume they are in the stage of change where they are at least contemplating change. They've taken some initial step toward a shelter that they think can help make a change in their status of being unhoused. They are working with people who generally are weighing the pros and cons of staying homeless versus not homeless, and they're going to be more receptive to conversations around next steps. If you're working with somebody in an outreach setting, they are much more likely to be in that pre-contemplative state of change, which means they haven't really even started thinking about the benefits of what it might look like to work with somebody. And that means they are more likely to respond to your suggestions of, hey, we should talk about this. We might want to find a way to get you indoors, with some defensiveness or some passivity or even some anger around your suggestion that they should be living their life in a different way. There are radically different ways that you engage with people based on where they are in that moment. And so we talk all the time about meeting people where they are, but that also applies to the kinds of questions we ask, the speed or the pace of questioning we might do, how we initially focus on exclusively building trust and bringing coffee and socks as opposed to thinking about what kind of job they might want a few years from now, and understanding that while the core tenets of the work that we do are the same, the way we approach different people in different areas might look different based on where they would initially interface with us.
John, that makes me think of OrgCode's video not long ago with regards to like goals and tasks, the differences between them. And we set these large, lofty goals when it's probably 2 years down the road. So let's concentrate on, like you said, getting a coffee and getting a pair of socks.
Yeah, I just need to know where I'm going to use the bathroom tonight and where I can sleep without getting beaten up. That's
Yeah.
that's my long-term planning very often in that state.
Okay. Another question here is, but what are your thoughts on the value or not of coordinating outreach across multiple agencies? Do you distinguish between grassroots volunteer approaches and the formal agency teams?
Yes, very much yes. So coordinating outreach is possible. It has been done well across multiple teams, but anytime we're coordinating, there has to be a shared goal. Everybody has to be trying to accomplish the same thing. When you introduce, so let's start with like professional, skilled, trained outreach workers. Some people may have lived expertise. Some people may have some education that ties to working with humans. And all of those people are united around this goal of how do we connect people to the housing system? How do we connect people to opportunities to get housed? That is one goal. And when people are all working around that goal, it can work. Now, when we introduce sort of volunteer or more charitable models of outreach, very often their goal is not getting people housed, it's getting people sandwiches, it's getting people bottles of water, it's evaluating how successful I am by how many of my business cards I gave out and saying, I talked to 300 people today. And I would argue that talking to 300 people is less of an accomplishment than moving one person more closely to housing. And so it's absolutely possible, but there has to be some kind of coordinating entity or a shared planning meeting around one, what are we trying to do? And it could be that some people go out and give out socks and peanut butter all day long, and that's awesome, but they should never talk to people about housing because we don't want people to think, to the person on the street, an outreach worker is an outreach worker is an outreach worker. So if they try to talk to somebody about housing and that person just wants to talk about if they need another bottle of water, they're going to end up leaving with this impression that, well, I tried to talk to an outreach worker once and it didn't go anywhere. I'm not going to try again. Um, there has to be some clarity around what those outreach teams are trying to do in order for all of that to work. It is not impossible. It can be done very well. It could even be three different agencies have three different professional street outreach teams who are trying to house people. And then there's another one that just does healthcare, and another one that just does benefits enrollment, and another one that just worries about this or this other kind of crucial need, but they have to be aware of who has the lead on housing people. And to the greatest extent possible, the people who they are working with, well, it's not really their responsibility to know the difference between you. There should be some clarity around if you're going to talk to somebody about housing, talk to outreach worker A, B, or C. If you just need some help fixing your tent that flooded last night, well, then you could talk to somebody in D, E, or F, but to make sure that there's an understanding of here's what each group helps with and here's what each group doesn't help with.
Yeah, I've got to jump in on a follow-up question there.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen models where those that coordinated outreach, if organization A is really good at ID and organization B is really good at housing and organizational C is really good at giving out water, where they actually come together and the group that goes out to the road is made up of those three different organizations so that we can continue that support as you go along?
Maybe not such a clean allocation, but certainly, yeah, like it could be that the medical outreach team doesn't need to just be a group of 20 medical students who go out once every 2 weeks and just all 20 show up at somebody's camp, but maybe two or three people could embed with this outreach team that's really good with housing and this one that's really good with IDs. And as long as there's a way that they can share information and make sure that if I'm a housing focused outreach worker who has no business diagnosing whether or not your open wound is infected, that there's a guaranteed connection that that person or that team would come out the next time, which also can be a really good trust building exercise to say, hey, listen, I'm not a doctor. And I also know you don't want to go to the hospital right now, but what I will do is I will bring somebody who is a doctor or who can make that kind of determination out next time. And it's really no different than saying, hey, next time I show up, I'll make sure I have some socks for you. It's just some other connection to that service.
I love that trust building piece with that. Um, okay, you mentioned, this is another question. You mentioned that the risk of borrowing against the credibility of another part of the system. What are some ways outreach and shelters can address that tension and their realities and constraints look very different?
Ugh. Well, tried to get into some of those. I mean, okay, at minimum, don't talk trash about the other program. Like, let's start there because, and again, sometimes, and I have done that in the past. Like, of course, that shelter kicked you out. They're not designed for people who are actually struggling. They're designed for, they only let in college educated people who already have a job and have been sober for 90 days. Like, that's not the right shelter for you. But starting with and some of this is kind of outside of the maybe what an individual program can do, but at the system level, like getting the folks who are leading these programs involved in a way where there is shared information, where there is shared victory of like a housing placement happened because we worked together to make this happen. um, but really it comes down to on the individual level, never taking that shortcut to building trust by just trying to position yourself and that person against the shelter system. Or if you're in the shelter, never trying to position yourself and a shelter guest against the outreach team, whether that's due to approaches to harm reduction or expectations or safety requirements or anything, making sure that we have to be seen as parts of the same system. Again, that doesn't have to mean anything to the people who we're serving, but when we're talking with people, making sure that we're trying to find some way not to put a silver lining on something that they don't want, but to help them understand that navigating this might be different and that difference is for a reason. Maybe shelters have to do different things because you're navigating congregate living. You can't just tell somebody to go set up a bed 500 feet from the other person like you could with a tent. That might diffuse some conflict. So always making sure that we are seen as part of the same. We are colleagues in this work. We are kind of co-conspirators in the effort to get you housed. And some people find it most effective if we do this directly from the street or from a park bench. Some people find it most helpful to be in a bed where they can wake up and know where their case manager is the next morning. But helping people sort of see that it's not that one part of the system is inherently bad or one is inherently good. It's that one might work better for you, and there might be times that there's some benefits to it, even short term, and one might not work so well for you, and that's fine. It doesn't mean it's a bad program. It just means that this is the one that works best for you, and that's why I'm so glad that we're talking together and having this conversation, because my job is to help you figure out what's the best possible way forward for you.
Um, you touched on this briefly, but what role do people with lived experience need to play in shaping and the designing of our street outreach programs, and the shelter access coordination?
Certainly a large role that would be really driven. I think that becomes less about policy and more about implementation. So and in our work, we use people who have had lived expertise in some phenomenal ways. We also sometimes hire them to be the janitors at our shelters and say we have staff who have lived experience, but they never actually have some information about program design. Um, I think there's some real-time opportunity, and it could look as simple as a debrief with the person, like, hey, here's what I had shared with you about shelter. Did what happened match what I told you? Or was there something else for the next person I might be sharing that you wished you would have known? Like that's real time use of lived experience to improve services for the next people. It doesn't necessarily have to be like once a year we have a lived experience conference and we look at every single policy and every single procedure that somebody goes through. It could be like, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you feel like you were treated with respect when you first got there? And if that number is not consistently an 8 or above, then we need to go back and say what happened that led to that. Was it just that the shelter staff was busy and they were a little bit short with you in the moment when you got there? Was it that they weren't there at all? So there's a huge role for this, but it tends to be in my mind and in my experience as both a shelter operator and an outreach team lead at points, like how the heck did what we say actually tie to what your experience was and what could we have done that would have better prepared you for what happened there?
I love that answer, John. The fact that, we're getting away from some of that formal lived experience committees and that type of thing, and literally just getting down there and actually asking people about what their experience is at the time is such valuable information that allows programs to grow and that quality improvement stuff that you talked about. So we've got time for a couple more here. For individuals who are more entrenched and have had a negative shelter experience, what coordination practices have you seen actually rebuild trust enough for someone to re-engage in shelter?
So so after all of that kumbaya talk about never talking trash about another part of the system, it's worth noting that some shelters do not provide a great experience for people. And sometimes that is due to funding or lack of staffing. Sometimes that is sort of they've embraced this sort of tough love approach that they think is the solution to behavior change that really has no research behind it. But I it's hard to give a real general answer about that because what you don't want to do is say, hey, come on, try it again. It'll be different this time if you don't know that that's the case. So I think, Kevin, some of the work that y'all had done that really started to look at like, why aren't people coming in? What are the things what are the barriers that are keeping them from coming in? And you were fortunate enough, as I understand it, to have some control over what that initial experience would be for people when they came into shelter. When we're working with other programs, sometimes the most honest, trust building answer you can give somebody is I have some concerns around whether that's going to be a good experience for you, based on what's happened, based on what you've told me about shelter. And here are some potential ways around that. There's not always a good answer, but so I'm not really going to answer the question, but I'm going to say the coordination practices that would rebuild trust stem from maybe there's some opportunity like y'all did to show, hey, here's the actual shelter. Here's what it looks like. You've heard it's loud and scary and unclean and dangerous. And here's actually like what it looks like in a day to day of people going in. Here is who you're going to talk to. I know them personally, and I'm going to let him know that you're coming so that when you get there, you can, if you know nobody else there, you can check in with this person and they can be your contact. It could be a commitment that says, hey, listen, if you're interested, why don't you try this for 2 or 3 days? Ask the other people in your camp to keep an eye on your stuff if you feel safe doing that. And I'll commit to you that if after 3 days you're not interested in that at all, I'll be back here to work with you. So some ways of buffering this, like accepting that this is a huge change for people and people don't always do well in change. And even people who are housed and have all the income in the world don't always succeed in making big behavioral changes. So recognizing that there's only so much we can do based on what the actual realities of the shelter system look like. And so in that case, it's more around being really clear and really transparent and not making promises that the shelter system or the relationships you have with people in the shelter system that those they can't make good on.
Awesome. Thank you. I just, in looking at time here, I think we've got to most of the questions. If we didn't get to a specific question, I think that John has answered the themes that are throughout there. I just want to hand it back to Grant because I know we always have some last minute wrap up things. John, I want to thank you. I could sit here and talk to you for the next 8 hours about this,
Oh,
and I'm sure everyone else online could as well.
well, thanks. Thanks for the chance to do this too. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for leading the Q&A. And again, yes, thank you so much, John, for sharing your time and your knowledge with everyone here today. It is greatly appreciated. We are right on the 90-minute mark. So I want to thank Kevin and John. I want to thank everyone that's joined us across the country. Thank you for your continued participation, your comments in the chat, your questions that really help generate some discussion. I just do also want to say that this will be my last webinar with CSTN. It's been a true honor to kind of host these sessions for the last couple of years, and I'm looking forward to seeing the next person taking over this role to kind of continue this work with this group and continue to grow the network and continue to expand the work around housing focused shelters. It's been a pleasure being in this role, and hope that my work going forward that I can intersect with many of the members again in a new capacity. So, wishing you all the best in your continued shelter transformation work. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Be well. And we will make sure that you get all the content, the recording, and different links in a follow-up email. So, be well, everyone. Bye for now.